mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name is Brittany Kavinsky. It is now 1 p.m. so we will begin our presentation shortly. Today on Friday, June 14th, we will have our presentation on What Not to Do, Lessons Learned from the Failure of Others, given by Andrew Murray. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box and we will be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of the sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible, as well as the Economic Development Division for sponsoring today's webcast. As you can see, we have quite a few webcasts planned for this summer. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcast and register for your webcast of choice. You can now follow us on Twitter at Planning Webcast or like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is Friday, June 14th, and then select today's webcast, which is What Not to Do, Lessons Learned from the Failure of Others. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are also recording today's webcast and it will be available on our YouTube channel later today. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will be made available upon request. At this time, I would like to introduce Andy Struckoff, who will introduce our speaker for today, Andrew Murray.
Thank you, Brittany. Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Struckoff. I'm Associate Director of PGAV Planners and a member of the Economic Development Division of the American Planning Association. I encourage you to go to the APA's website and take a look at the divisions page and click on the Economic Development Division page and check out our blog and other events we have upcoming throughout the rest of the year. Andrew Murray is a project manager with PGAV, and he's going to tell you a little bit about some experiences we've had, either directly or tangentially, with projects in the region that have failed for one reason or another, and lessons learned from those projects. So that'll hand it over to Andrew.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you to everybody for attending today. I'm hoping that this will be interesting, and I encourage you, if you have questions throughout the conversation, that you just type them in that chat box, and we'll address those towards the end of the presentation. So Andy and I and some other folks were sitting around. We were talking about some of the bad situations, some of our clients and some of the other things that have been in the news lately. And we were just thinking, you know, a lot of these folks are pretty smart people, and they got themselves in some pretty bad situations. And so we thought it would be helpful to kind of explore some of these case studies, and perhaps, you know, we can learn something from the failure of others. All right. My contact information is up on the screen. It'll be up at the end of the presentation as well. So here's a couple of proverbs that I think are helpful. The first one is sometimes attributed to Mrs. Roosevelt, but it's learn from others' mistakes. You can't possibly live long enough to make them all yourself. Another old proverb says the wise learn from other people's mistakes and fools from their own. And then lastly, King Solomon, many, many years ago, said, the way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. So if I were to sum that up in social media terms, I would say, don't be that guy. All right, so the world in 2013. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pressures that economic developers and planners face today. I've noticed that many of the folks who are signed up for this webinar are municipal planners or municipal economic developers, and most, if not all of you, will relate to some of these issues that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So the first thing is if someone's been asleep the last few years, we've been in a pretty bad recession. We're coming out of it. We're technically out of it, but we're still feeling the effects of it. And most importantly, unemployment rates are still really, really high, especially historically. And so there's a lot of pressure, I'm sure, to create jobs, whatever that means, and to make sure that large employers or small employers or anybody who wants to start a business is able to come to your community. And there's a lot of pressure from politicians and from other folks to make sure that happens, whatever that means. So that kind of goes hand in hand with some of these other things. There's also decreasing population and decreasing unemployment for some areas. This is especially true in a lot of the rural communities we work in. The population is aging or it's moving to the cities. Another thing we see, there's a decreasing return on investment. That goes for a lot of different situations. You know, the developers are able to accept projects that have a lower and lower rate of return, and so there's just a lot of pressure to see something still happen, and it's definitely still an issue. There's also competition for retail. So there's not been a lot of retail growth in the last 6-7 years, but the retail that does exist has sort of moved around, and so there's a lot of competition, especially if you're in a metro area, between municipalities. There's lower sales revenues. So this chart here that I've got up shows that even though state revenues are going back up, local revenues continue to fall. A lot of this is due to, you know, property tax collections decreasing, but also just continued lower sales taxes. And then last couple things, there's an aging infrastructure in most of our communities that just requires a lot of money to keep up. Aging bridges, you know, we've had a couple of large bridge collapses in the last few years. There's just a lot of aging issues going on. And then lastly is overbuilt sprawl. So a number of the communities we work in, they were built at the boom times, and so they're sort of overextended. And I know a lot of the folks who are in Arizona and California, Texas, Florida, places, Michigan, places like that probably are experiencing this issue. All right, so as I was talking about, our local sales taxes are not increasing. They've pretty much been flat since the recession. And this is a real problem for a lot of municipalities that are dependent on these local sales taxes. And so this creates a pressure to see projects happen, to see job creation happen, to see retailers come to your city, or to steal retailers from your neighbors. And so this is a chart that I pulled just this week that shows that it's pretty much been flat. All right, and to speak to this point of aging infrastructure, I recommend that everybody check out strongtowns.org. There's a really great guy named Chuck who runs that site, and he talks about sort of what he calls the Ponzi scheme of growth. I know the APA's had him on numerous different times, and a lot of state chapters have had him. He's fantastic, and there's a couple quotes here I'm going to read off that talk about aging infrastructure, and this creates a pressure on communities also to see projects happen. So the Society of Civil Engineers reported in 2008 that the nation's infrastructure needs $2.2 million in repairs over the next 5 years. And to put that in perspective, that's $29,000 for a family of 4 just to catch up. That was a few years ago, obviously. Also, he's from Minnesota, and he talks about how there's $65 billion needed in transportation projects over the next 20 years. So these are real issues that our communities are facing that put pressure on us to make these deals happen, whatever they might be. Another thing that's going on, this is sort of a host of problems that are interconnected. There's just decreasing state and local money. Most municipalities have seen their community development block grants decrease over the last 10 years. Pensions are up, so a lot of municipalities where they have a large pension responsibility that oftentimes is not sustainable. And then just unfunded mandates given down from the federal and state governments. This is just, as the money gets in short supply, the buck gets passed. Just this week, the Wall Street Journal noted that the state of Illinois, which we can pick on since we're in Missouri, that they're in a really bad situation. They've got basically a $100 billion shortfall in their pension system, and their credit actually getting downgraded, and it's in danger of being downgraded below A, which is the first time a state has been in that situation since California was almost 10 years ago. All right, so I guess the moral of the story is that smart people make bad decisions. So there's a little quote there on the side that says, everything happens for a reason, but sometimes the reason is that you're stupid and you make bad decisions. And it's funny and it's maybe a little mean, but the reality of the situation is all of these case studies that we're going to discuss today, these people for the most part weren't stupid. They were educated folks. They thought they knew what they were doing. They're people just like you and I. They don't necessarily, it's something that we could easily do ourselves. And so I just want to make sure that as we're going through these, that we may chuckle at some of these disastrous schemes that folks have tried to do or seen happen to their communities. But it's not really funny. It could happen in your community, and you need to make sure that you're doing the best for your client or for your taxpayers. And so I just want to make sure as we go through these that we realize that these are smart people who've made these bad mistakes. So the reason why people make these decisions for a host of reasons, but a couple of them up there, budget pressures we talked about, political pressures, you've got a mayor or you've got a county executive or somebody who's leaning on you pretty hard to see a deal happen. People get caught up in the emotion of the moment, the pride that they have in the community, or their own personal pride as an economic developer. You want to say, oh, I brought $200 million worth of investment to the community in the last 5 years or whatever it is. Oftentimes, people get bad information or incomplete information. They get poor advice, sometimes from very high-paid consultants. And lastly, people just don't do their due diligence. They don't do their homework, and they're lazy. And so all that oftentimes equals a bad decision. So I'm going to go through these case studies. This first one's one of our more spectacular ones that we've had happen here in Missouri. Oh yeah, before you do that, Andy's saying I should probably do a poll. So real quickly before I go through this, Brittany has a poll for us. If you could pull that up, Brittany, then we'll go ahead and take that before we move on.
All right, it's up now.
Okay. So the poll says, the poll talks about your level of experience with economic development, and I just kind of want to get an idea of folks out there who are listening, if they've had quite a bit of experience with economic development or incentives, or if they've had a limited experience. That'll help me as I go through to make sure I don't, go too high over anybody's head or make this too basic.
All right, we have about 75% of people's votes in. We have the majority, 54%, have somewhat a limited working knowledge. 32% said very. They feel that they know enough to be dangerous. 7% said extremely, and 7% said not at all.
Okay, great. So it sounds like folks are pretty much in the middle of the road here. So I'll go ahead and continue on then on our case study. So I think that's helpful. All right. So this is a case study that was very spectacular, politically charged situation that we had here in Missouri over the last few years. Our state Department of Economic Development got some inquiries from a Chinese company that made artificial sweeteners, or at least supposedly made artificial sweeteners, and they approached the State Department of Economic Development looking for a site to develop this state-of-the-art artificial sweetener plant that was going to hire 600 people. It sounded like an awesome, exciting opportunity. There were 3 different communities here in Missouri, all in the range of 10,000 to 20,000 people in population that competed for this. Moberly, the city of Moberly won selection. Moberly is a small town, kind of out on the prairie, 13,000 people, and they went for this. They got advice from the state to go for it, and they used their development authority, their industrial development authority, to issue almost $40 million in bonds to pay for the construction of this plant. The plant was, like I said, going to be state-of-the-art, and the bonds were backed by intellectual property rights for the patents on the artificial sweetener. And the purported value of those patents was $50 million. The state pledged $17 million in incentives. Now, those incentives were tied to the requirement that the plant actually open and employ these 600 people. And the city of Moberly, however, didn't really have a way to back these bonds, and they couldn't really get them issued without providing a guarantee. So the deal was Mamtech was going to pay Moberly $4 million annually, and then Moberly was going to pay their Industrial Development Authority the same amount, and then the Industrial Development Authority was going to pay the bondholders. Well, bad things happen. So this situation was a total disaster. The plant did not happen. Construction started but was not completed. And come to find out, there was actually no Chinese artificial sweetener plant, or at least no one's to date been able to find a reputable source that says there is one. The intellectual property that the city acquired through this default was worth basically nothing, and consequently, Mamtech was not able to make their payments to the city, which didn't make the payments to the Development Authority, which subsequently defaulted on the bonds, $40 million worth of bonds. The Mamtech CEO was indicted for fraud. There was a lot of blame that was thrown around. The Missouri Department of Economic Development blamed the city blamed them. They blamed their attorneys, who blamed Mamtech, who blamed their attorneys once again. So there's just a lot of blame to go around. And the unfortunate situation was that Moberly basically was stuck with the bill on this. So one of the big quotes in this whole debacle was in the paper. A Missouri Department of Economic Development official said, starting to sound a bit fishy. Unfortunately, this was like a year before the plant even started and the bonds were issued. So there were serious doubts that folks had in this deal that they didn't necessarily raise or didn't broadcast very well. And the city of Moberly, in defaulting on these loans, said the city's taxpayers under these circumstances should not bear the burden of Mamtech's failures or be asked to bail out their shareholders or investors. See, the deal was that this $4 million payment was roughly equal to Moberly's annual budget. And so there was no way that Moberly could make these payments if Mamtech defaulted. And the bond market saw, New York Times quotes this saying that the bond market basically viewed this as the city defaulting, even though it was their industrial development authority, and they reduced their credit to junk status. All right, so what are some lessons we can learn from MAMTech? One thing I think is that, you know, the bond attorneys and a lot of the folks that were involved in this were very intelligent people. They were the best of the best. The trustee bank was one of the top banks here in St. Louis for these sorts of deals. These were people that knew what they were doing. But it doesn't necessarily protect you from fraud or from negligence. Second thing is, don't assume everybody else is doing the due diligence. You know, nobody checked out to see if that plant existed. There were some attempts made, but ultimately nobody made sure that this was a legitimate company. Third thing is the city pledged its full faith and credit to back these obligations, something that we typically, unless it's the deal of the century, we really discourage our clients here at PJV Planners from doing that sort of thing. It just puts the city on the hook for somebody else's irresponsible actions.
And hi, this is Andy Struggle. Just adding one thing. One interesting item about this deal too is that once the city of Moberly decided to pledge its full faith and credit to the bonds, the folks involved relaxed their due diligence a little bit with respect to MAMTech and focused instead on the creditworthiness of the city as the backup sort of payer for the bonds.
Right. So they stopped even looking at MAMTech. They just started looking at seeing how strong the city's faith and credit was, and you know, basically said, well, the city could pay on this for 100 years, and they would if they hadn't defaulted. So, also, even if your state Department of Economic Development says it's a good deal, don't necessarily assume that they've, you know, if it's you on the line, make sure that you do your due diligence as well. And then also, if it's too good to be true, you know, your mom said so. All right. Second case study. This is a small community, fairly wealthy community here in St. Louis metro area. This was a deal actually that we helped the city on. Unfortunately, they didn't take our advice on a number of fronts, and so what happened happened. But want to put it up here as sort of a lessons learned. There was a developer who saw in the city's economic development plan that there was an opportunity for on a high traffic corner to do something pretty special. And so this developer wanted to build a $184 million lifestyle center. It was going to be anchored by a company that's now been bought out by Macy's, a large department store, and some other major tenants. And it was on this corner, but the catch was that there were 300 properties, including 200 plus homes, fairly expensive homes, on 67 acres. So the city really wanted to see this happen because it was a great intersection. There was a lot of money that was planned and promised. And so not only did the city offer to do a tax increment financing district, they also offered to support the developer and use eminent domain to buy out any sort of stragglers who didn't want to sell. So things kind of started off fairly well, even though it was a pretty ambitious project. The developer was able to acquire 91% of the parcels. But the developer was sued by a few of the landowners in there. Those landowners were, it's rumored, bankrolled by a large mall just down the street, which didn't want to see a competing development come in. And so the developer was sued. Unfortunately, he had made some mistakes in putting together his development scheme, and he'd also made all the people, including us who worked for him, take sign a confidentiality agreement. And so they were unable to testify to the financial feasibility of the project in the redevelopment plan to the extent that they needed to in order to sort of button it down. Basically, the courts threw out the TIF, which made it to where the developer couldn't get their financing. The developer subsequently failed to close on 200 homes that had already had buyout contracts signed. Many homeowners were stuck with second mortgages because they had already moved and bought other homes, assuming that the deal was going to go through. Some folks had actually gutted the houses and taken out the appliances and the AC units and all that. And the upshot was that the nice subdivision was left severely deteriorated, and that the homeowner occupancy rate dropped from 70 to 50%. It's pretty much the opposite of what the city wanted to see happen on that corner. So a couple of lessons we can learn from this particular sad situation is that it was a little too ambitious. The city was advised by us and others that it was the developer was too ambitious, and that it was dependent on too many things happening just so. The second thing I think I would say is don't put your citizens at the mercy of a developer who's not thought through all of the different alternative scenarios. So if this deal doesn't happen, what are you going to be left with at the end of the day? And the very unfortunate thing in this situation is that even though the city didn't back its full faith and credit, the city didn't lose money on the deal, they sort of put their citizens, made their citizens hostage to this situation. And even though you could blame the homeowners for taking out second mortgages and for gutting their properties before they had actually sold them, which was obviously foolish, they were kind of led by the city and the developer to believe that the project was a done deal. All right, here's my favorite. This is one of my communities that I work in that we've been helping to sort of get out of the situation that they're in. I've changed the name of the community because I don't want to embarrass them. And it's a great community, but one that made some pretty bad decisions. So this community is in a growing part of the state. It's seen a lot of boom happen, especially pre-recession. During this time, there was a really active Main Street group downtown that really they cared about their community. They really wanted to take advantage of some of the growth that was happening, and they really wanted to see their downtown just prosper and grow. And so this active group of citizens was looking to revitalize their community. They had a charrette process, a lot of public involvement. They drew some amazing pictures, came up with a new urbanist vision for their community. They had designed condos that overlooked this beautiful river. They had a lifestyle center envisioned that was going to be walkable and cutting edge, and it was going to be amazing. They got all the politicians and officials got on board. They got their incentives lined up. They pledged TIF and SID and tax abatement and whatever else they could throw at the thing. And then some pretty bad mistakes were made. So the city failed to acquire all the parcels in this property. There was a big fight over whether or not to use eminent domain. There were 5 parcels right in the middle of this big area that didn't want to sell. And you can see the picture there of part of at least one of the homeowners who was angry about their house being potentially eminent domain. So these folks refused to sell, which made the property difficult to develop. The city decided not to use eminent domain to acquire those parcels because it was politically toxic. The city, in the meantime, took out multiple loans totaling $4 million to acquire all this property. They then demolished all of the buildings, and then in late 2007, the developer, who was also, ironically, the architect, went to banks to try and get a loan. This was late 2007 on this very, very ambitious project. The banks laughed at them, and they weren't able to get a loan. The project was canceled. The city tried to sue the developer architect and recoup some money, but they had nothing to stand on, and essentially they were left holding the bag. They are currently paying almost $500,000 in annual interest and principal payments, and they've been paying that since 2007. And this is for a city that is about 15,000 people. So some lessons from this unfortunate situation. The city failed, I would say, to hire some respected attorneys and planners that specialized in this redevelopment process. So I think that caveat is really important, because you can hire nice people, you can hire well-qualified people, but if they aren't well-qualified for what you're trying to do, they may be the wrong people to hire. In this case, I would argue that it was. They also failed to get a redevelopment agreement with protections. So when they acquired these properties and set up this deal with this developer, there was no protections for them. Essentially, they assumed all of the risk for the development. The city was essentially acting as their own developer. Third thing is I would say make sure you have political support to use eminent domain if you need eminent domain to complete the project. So if you have a couple of properties that if you don't acquire them and everybody else says that they want to do the project, you need to make sure that your political will is out there to do eminent domain. And most people aren't big fans of eminent domain. I'm not personally a big fan of eminent domain, but you know, there are situations where if there's one holdout who's asking for $2 million for their, you know, $50,000 home, that maybe you need to use it, or maybe you need to not do the project. And lastly, don't move until financing closes. So the city demolished all of these properties before they had any kind of financing in place. And so now, you know, the land that they took out loans for was worth $4 million. It was recently appraised, you know, without houses, for $1.6 million. So they essentially owe, you know, more than double what they paid. Yeah, they owe more than double what the assessed value of their properties. All right. Recently, I'm sure a lot of you read it, there was a great series in the New York Times about incentives and how they're used and kind of how these deals, some of these deals work. There was a great article that was written that goes into detail on a number of different deals and states and that sort of thing. The article came out in December 2012, and I've got it listed in my resources. I'd recommend everybody check it out. It's called "The United States of Subsidies." This is a case study that came from that that I think is somewhat helpful. So a lot of municipalities, they have for years chased smokestacks. So they're looking for the next manufacturing plant, the next car plant, the next you know, oil refinery, whatever it would be, to come to their community and bring a lot of jobs. And in a lot of cases, that's a great thing for a small community, especially if you can get some good quality, high-paying jobs. In the particular case of General Motors, for years General Motors has played one community off of another in trying to get these plants established. And in the particular case of Michigan communities, there are a lot of sort of bad stories to be told. So in this particular case, the city granted $200 million in investments over a number of years. The first factory closed in the 1990s, and the city tried to sue to try and recoup some of those incentives. Unfortunately, they lost. They had some clawback provisions in there, but they weren't enforceable. So I would sort of note that if I were a municipality, that clawback provisions aren't always enforceable. Make sure that they're legally enforceable. The second plant closed in 2010, and subsequently GM was bailed out by the federal taxpayers. So, and they went bankrupt. And then this town ended up with the highest foreclosure rate in the country. It's a sad tale. The second tale is from Shreveport, Louisiana. The article goes into detail about this. The folks in Shreveport really wanted to get a car plant to town. GM said, well, we don't have an electric car plant that we're wanting to site in your community, but we'll site a Hummer factory. And despite the protestations of the community and the sort of misgivings of it being a sort of backward-looking technology, not a forward-looking technology, the city agreed, and they put up subsidies to get that plant to happen. Obviously, no one buys Hummers anymore, and the plant closed, and the city was sort of left holding the bag on this plant that's basically obsolete for any sort of useful purpose. This is a great quote in the article, a New York Times article from the city attorney. He says, you just can't make these promises and throw them around like they're spare change in the drawer. And he's talking about the promises that the company made in order to get the incentives for the projects. And I guess I'd tell the city attorney, yeah, they can make empty promises, and they can take your company for a ride. So, make sure that you're protected. All right, so those are some case studies of some really bad things that have happened to communities that you obviously don't want to happen to your community. But I want to talk for a few minutes about what we can do to protect our clients or our municipalities, our taxpayers, from making these poor mistakes. Montgomery County, Maryland, recently put out a great report that was a review of their economic development incentive programs. And I would really recommend anybody check this report out. If you need a copy of it, feel free to contact me, and I can send you the right spot or send you a copy. It's from February of this year. And in this report, it's one of they talk about some best practices to maximizing the effectiveness of your incentive programs. And I'm going to talk about these sort of categories in a brief sense. So bear with me for a few minutes. So the first thing that they talk about is make sure that you align your incentives with a clearly articulated economic development strategy. So make sure that you've got goals that are set up for maximizing the economic development potential of your community. And you want to make sure that if you're calling for high-wage job creation, that you have the ability to provide the workforce for high-paying jobs. And you want to make sure that you have a strategy and a plan so that as people come to your community, you can see if their plans as a business line up with what you want to see happen in your community. And then you're not dependent on the whims and wills of whatever developer comes to town, selling whether it be snake oil or something actually good. The second thing is make sure you conduct a cost-benefit analysis to see if we provide incentives and we support this project with taxpayer dollars, that we are going to get a benefit that is at least the same as the incentive or greater. So you need to hire somebody who is competent, if you don't have somebody on your staff, to really make that assessment and not rely on the figures and facts that the developer gives to you. The third thing is make sure that your incentives align with business needs. So, make sure that if the developer pulls out, that what you got out of the deal will be useful for your community. So, for example, instead of just making a cash payment to the developer or giving them tax abatement or a sales tax rebate, perhaps you offer to build them a road, or perhaps you offer to expand the airport, or to put in utilities, or perhaps you offer to train a workforce for them, so that when they don't come to town, that you are left with some useful things for your community, some infrastructure or some well-trained workers, whatever the case might be. Fourth thing is make sure that in your deal you include clear performance standards, mechanisms for monitoring performance, and penalties in case there's a breach of contract in the agreements. And as I mentioned before, if you do a clawback, what's commonly referred to as a clawback, make sure that's enforceable. So you really need to have a qualified attorney, not just your local city attorney, but somebody who knows these incentive programs depending on your state and can evaluate them correctly and make sure that whatever penalties that you have in there are enforceable should the developer pull out. And I'd also say there is oftentimes if the developer goes bankrupt, which happens in these cases, you may not be able to get anything out of the developer, so definitely keep that in mind. And make sure that you're putting the kinds of clawback provisions in there that you'll need for your community. So a few of those might include making a requirement on a certain number of jobs, making a requirement of a certain amount of investment, requiring the project to be substantially complete by a certain date, or requiring the developer to meet certain performance measures, whatever the case might be in that situation. And there's some great resources on developing those, and I'll list those at the end of my presentation. The Council of Development Financing Agencies has some great resources, as well as the International Economic Development Council, IDC, has some great resources that I'll list at the end of the presentation. All right, so the last thing I would say, make sure that you update your incentive programs regularly. So evaluate to make sure that your plan meets the meets your goals and your objectives as of today, and make sure that whatever incentive requirements that you have are actually getting you what you want. And if anybody needs some useful resources on developing an economic development policy, I would highly recommend a document that the Government Finance Officers Association has put out that talks about how to do that. And I'll have that at the end of the presentation as well. All right, so a few thoughts here to wrap up. I would say that no deal is better than a bad deal. When I first moved to the state of Missouri, there were two projects on the books, one for Kansas City and one for St. Louis. And if anybody's from Missouri, they know that there's a rivalry between our two large metro areas. And the city of Kansas City developed this Power and Light district in their downtown, beautiful district. It's a great location. And they, in order to make the deal work, this is pre-recession, they agreed to back the project with general obligations. And unfortunately, the project has not met the revenue projections that it was supposed to meet, and the city is paying $15 million every year on the shortfall on this project. And that's in addition to another project they're paying $5 million on. So that's almost $20 million in, in money that they're expending annually on nothing. And they have a great project in their downtown, but it's costing the taxpayers a lot of money. In contrast, St. Louis had the Cardinals baseball team had this site right next to the stadium that they were going to turn into what they called Ballpark Village. Same developer as Kansas City. I was working on at a firm that was evaluating this project, and we advised the city not to back it with general obligations. And the city decided not to back it with general obligations, to not pay it out of, not pay a shortfall out of any sort of funds. And the project never happened, and it remained a big hole in the ground. And the city was mocked up one side, down the other, for failing to make this project happen. But at the end of the day, you know, the taxpayers weren't put on the hook for any sort of development, and in retrospect, they definitely would have. They would have been in the same situation as Kansas City. So, you know, I guess my argument in this case, that situation would be no deal is better than a bad deal. And you may have a beautiful development, but if you're paying millions and millions of dollars every year for the, I guess, the privilege of having that development, it may not be worth your time. Second thing is, as planners, we really have the obligation to look out for the public, even in the face of political pressure. And I mentioned that in Ballpark Village. I mentioned that in some of these other situations. I know a lot of municipal planners and economic developments get leaned on pretty hard by their mayors, their boards, their politicians, to make sure that something happens. And maybe there's some influential people in town that know the developer and they want to see the project happen. And so, you know, it's our responsibility, according to our AICP Code of Ethics, to make sure that we do the best work and we look out for the interests of the public and not just our jobs or the political whims and wills of our community. Third, I'd say due diligence is really your responsibility. You know, no one's going to look at this besides you, and I think you need to take that approach. Next, I'd say make sure you base your decisions on facts, not emotions. You know, deals look great. If you ever shopped for a used car, you know that as soon as the salesman knows that you really, really want that car, the price is not going to come down. And so I guess as much as you can separate yourself from the emotional component, that's all the better for your community. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. You know, that's I know it's a cliche, but it really is true. There's so many situations that that is absolutely the case. And then lastly, I'd say make sure you get whatever is promised to you, whatever you are under the impression is going to happen. Make sure you get it in writing in a redevelopment agreement or a development agreement or some sort of legally binding document, and make sure you get it with the right between the right parties. And it's really important to hire the correct attorneys. And as much as I know folks don't like hiring attorneys and spending a lot of money, it's definitely worth it. And I would say whenever you can, make sure you pass those costs of hiring that attorney onto your developer. I know when we do TIF districts, and we do a lot of them here at PJV, we encourage our municipalities to require the developer to pay for all the planning and all the legal costs, and they roll that into their tax increment financing bond. And that just it protects the city from being on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal and planning costs for a project that never happened. All right, so I'm going to list a few resources here that I already mentioned. Strong Towns, I really recommend you check out the site, read everything on it. Great stuff. Talks about you know, the cost of development, the cost of sprawl, the cost of accepting deals that look good in the first 10 years, that maybe over 50 years don't turn out to be such a great financial investment for the community. I would check out Montgomery County's recent Economic Development Incentives Program analysis. I can get you a copy of that. You can Google it, or if somebody wants to contact me directly, I'll send you a copy. Look at developing an economic incentive policy. I mentioned the Government Finance Officers Association put this out in 2008. I think it's still really good. I think it's something that pretty much every community should have. CDFA has put out a really good tax increment financing best practices guide, and they also put out an advanced version of that in 2009 if you really are interested in learning more about tax increment financing and some best practices there. IDC puts out really great stuff. One of their great reports is Knowledge is Power. It talks about working with site selectors and gives a lot of good best practices for doing that. A lot of these projects involve site selection, agencies, and brokers, and that sort of thing. Check out the United States of Subsidies New York Times, and then I also would recommend to you the APA Economic Development Toolbox, which is on the APA's website. And as Andy mentioned, there's some good information on the Economic Development section website on the APA website. All right, so I'm going to leave up my contact information, and before I open it to questions, I want to see if Andy has any additional thoughts to add. All right, so we're done a few minutes early, but I want to open it up to questions, unless you have anything else.
Okay, great. Our first question comes in from John. How do you block or bar a developer from future considerations if they announce a project from a federal fund sponsor before their proposal was even considered?
So how do you block them from future consideration when they sort of let the cat out of the bag before everything is completed?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tactic that some people will do, because then the developer, basically puts the city over a barrel, and they're trying to pull in the political, basically get the political winds to blow against staff. So they'll pit the public and the politicians against, well-thinking and, responsible planning and economic development staff.
Right. It's almost at that point like they're playing a PR game.
Right.
They're the developer when they aren't the developer yet. So you got to stay in front of them and say, well, as soon as the application's approved, we'll consider them, but not committing the city before they need to be committed.
And this is tricky because you've got to make sure that you've got a supportive, whether it be Board of Aldermen, City Council, County Commission, whatever it be. I think you could definitely block them from consideration for incentives in the future. Even if not officially, you could definitely look with sort of limited favor on any future
that could be
responses to proposals.
That could be an administrative decision on the part of the city, particularly if they don't have any ownership of the property in question. If ownership of the property in question, it might be a little bit more difficult because then you're trying to restrict them from various uses on their property. But, if it's just an application stage.
And it kind of depends if it's a request for proposal situation or if it's actually just a developer who owns a site who's wanting to, to submit or an incentives package.
Okay, our next question comes in from Alyssa. She says that they have a similar situation going on in Rockland County, New York, where citizens could end up being on the hook for up to $60 million in costs related to a project. And it also seems to have resulted in a recent FBI raid on the town hall. So how can planners and related organizations help ensure that people and officials actually learn something from these kind of events?
Oh. I wish people did learn from these.
Sometimes they don't, and sometimes we've lost clients because they don't learn lessons the hard way.
Yeah, I mean, we've stopped working for some clients, to be really honest, that are acting unethically or illegally, and you can only do so much in your real limited role. But I think it's with any kind of whistleblower situation. If you're a planner and you're in a situation, if you're working for that community that gets raided by the FBI, maybe you want to start looking for another job, But I think the APA needs to be, make sure that we follow our code of ethics and we, when these things happen as a planning community, that we make sure we stand out against them, because really those sorts of situations give TIF and other incentives really a bad name. And we run into this all the time at public meetings where citizens are angry, and maybe legitimately so, for bad decisions that the municipality or the county has made in the past.
I hope that answer is helpful.
All right. Our next question comes in from James. Can you discuss the problem of companies selling the asset to a second company and then that company goes bankrupt?
Right. This happens with TIFs. Oftentimes, I would say make sure that goes back to your development agreement or your redevelopment agreement, that you have provisions in there to require approval for them to sell those assets on to a second company or a subsidiary or to another LLC, and make sure that you kind of retain those rights. And that may depend from state to state on whether or not they're able to do that. But to the extent that you can protect yourself legally, I would make sure you have good counsel from a legal perspective on that. I don't know if Andy, if you have anything else to.
I agree with that, and particularly, if bonds have already been issued on a project and the developer sells the underlying asset or the credit for the bonds, well then any risk with respect to that transaction is a risk felt by the bondholders and not the city, so long as the city or county doesn't back those bonds with their general revenues.
I think that goes back to the point of don't put your general, don't co-sign the loan basically as a city. If you can at all help it. I mean, it's just if it's that risky that they can't get a bond issue, then that means it's a risky deal, and that means that you may be on the hook for paying a lot of money down the road that you don't want to.
Okay, this question comes in from Wesley. Can you give us the location of the St. Louis City development that failed?
Oh, Ballpark Village? Ballpark Village is right next to the Cardinal Stadium.
Downtown St. Louis.
Downtown St. Louis, and actually, kind of ironically, it's getting built now. Now that the market's turned around, it's right next to the stadium.
To give you a little context, it was supposed to have been completed in 2009 in time for the All-Star game in St. Louis, which didn't happen. I mean, they're literally just under construction now as we speak.
And to add to irony, Andy and I worked on that deal a long time ago when we were at a different firm. To add to the irony, our company is now working on the Cardinals Hall of Fame Museum, which is in that development. And so we're just now starting to see some cool things happen on that site. But the city had to wait, basically because the city wouldn't back with general obligations, they had to wait another 4 years for the development to happen.
Right, and we're getting a project that's much, much smaller than originally envisioned.
Yeah, it was supposed to be high-end condos. This is during the boom. It was supposed to be high-end residential condos and office towers and, sort of a live entertainment arts district. And that may happen in 10 years. It may not. I don't know.
Okay. This one comes in from Jim. How frequently do you see states providing incentives to companies before the local unit of government is even aware of it?
That just depends on the politics of the state.
And it depends on the company involved. If it's a company that's already in the state, they'll start at their local community, and the local community will engage the State's Department of Economic Development and put together an incentive package to keep that company in town. If it's a company from out of state, depending on what the project is, they may hit, both simultaneously, or they may start at the state level. Usually it's what we see. And it also depends on the kind of incentives that they want. If they want more of a real estate incentive, they'll start locally. If they want more like a tax credit for their jobs, for the jobs they'll create, or if they want some sort of state, like in Missouri, a state income tax rebate, then they'll start at the state level.
Right. So if it's like Boeing or car plants or something like that, it's going to be Google, Twitter, something like that. It's going to be a much higher level of discussions. But I know that really irks municipalities to have the state sort of override them. And in the case of Mantech, the state was approached initially, and they funneled ultimately this fraudulent group to these local communities, which sort of gave this fraud a kind of state-sponsored feel to it. Even though that wasn't the case, that it wasn't that the state was sponsoring it, it's just that because it came through the state, Mantech kind of cloaked itself in a sort of a state.
Well, they wrapped themselves in credibility by having a former governor of the state of Missouri stuck for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next.
All right, this question comes in from Alyssa. What if the local government is not supportive? Any tips?
If the local government is not supportive of any TIFs?
Oh, sorry. Any tips if your local government is not supportive? Helpful hints.
Oh, helpful hints. Oh, that's a tough one. So we deal with that a lot more, it seems like. Folks skeptical in general about tax increment financing. Because maybe they've seen a project go the wrong way, or maybe they just philosophically disagree with it. If your state has any other tools that can achieve a similar goal, you can explore those. For example, in the state of Missouri, you can use tax abatement in conjunction with a special taxing district like a community improvement district or a transportation development district. You can pair those strategies to get a similar impact to a TIF district, but without as much of an impact to the city or county's revenue going forward, potentially. Generally, I think it's what municipalities really need to understand is the benefit going forward. If it's a good project, then if it's truly a good project, the city or the county will be better off over the long run with the TIF district in place.
And we run into a lot of sort of misunderstanding about what TIF is. TIF, people think that TIF involves the city writing a large check to a developer. And that isn't the case. That the project has to happen and perform, and then the monies that are raised through taxes on that project go back into the project. And only then does the developer get paid, unless you back it with general obligations, which we argue, for our clients not to do. But abuse of TIF or misunderstanding of TIF has generated a lot of false ideas about what it is, and so a lot of it's education,
And it helps if they have a clear policy and procedure for engaging TIF projects, for reviewing them, engaging with the developer on them. A lot of communities where we see opposition to TIF, they don't have any policy with which they can even start the process of considering a TIF application. Any communities that do have a clear process or committee set up to review those kinds of applications, I think, are able to understand the process a lot better.
And also another thing that it's required by a lot of states, but even if it's not, we encourage people, you need to look at, would this project happen without the TIF? And if it would happen without TIF financing, then you don't need to have a TIF for the project. And just because Walmart or Target or whoever it is comes to your town and says we need a TIF for this project to happen, you don't necessarily have to believe them. I mean, run the numbers and see if it would, and make sure that it's they're telling the truth. Do your cost-benefit analysis.
All right, and this question comes in from Daniel. Why not just make all incentives performance-based, little risk to the city?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a great plan. I mean, obviously there's devils in the details on that. The one thing I guess I would counsel is when you're putting together something like this, make sure that through your discussions that you don't make it difficult for the developer to get tenants. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we have some communities where they wanted to know all the tenants that are signed up, but in order for the tenants to sign up, they need to know what the incentive is, and that the project is actually going to happen. So I would say yes, do performance measures, requirements, but you can pledge at least on paper that you're going to provide the incentive in theory, and then just make sure that when you actually draft your redevelopment agreement that you've put those provisions in there and that they haven't weaseled out of getting them implemented in your redevelopment agreement.
Yeah, and I would say that any real estate tax-based incentive that can be monetized, or it could be that revenue stream that's created could be, bonds could be issued against that revenue stream, I think is inherently performance-based, because the developer is only able to bond as much revenue as they create with their project. So they at the outset say that they need a $50 million TIF, but they only create $30 million, and they only create enough value to bond $30 million, and that's all that they get, and that's,
yeah.
I think it's good.
And that goes back to not pledging the city's obligation to the bond.
All right, and this question comes in from Wesley. Recently, the court ruled in favor of the developer of the City of St. Louis North Side redevelopment moving forward. Do you know the status of this project?
There's a story in the paper a couple weeks ago saying that the developer's planning to start construction this fall on part of that North Side project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I worked for a firm that worked for the city, we evaluated that project on behalf of the city. The city, once again, didn't take on any risk for that project. For those folks who aren't from St. Louis or the Midwest, it's a huge TIF district in part of our town that is largely abandoned, and part of the inner city that is has very little left there structurally. There's a few homes left and a few scattered businesses. And this TIF was the size, to give folks the idea, is the size of a ward. So, Andy says it's 1,000 acres. So a huge TIF. And the city was pressured by the developer to back the project with general obligations. The city refused. The developer decided to go ahead anyway. It was tied up in court for a couple of years, but the state Supreme Court just ruled in favor of the developer. And so the project, as far as I know, is moving forward. I don't know, once again, because the city doesn't have any money on the hook. Whatever development the developer causes to happen, he gets paid when that happens. So, sort of, it behooves him to make something happen there. Whether or not it will happen, I suppose, is anybody's guess. But we'll see.
All right, next question comes in from Carter. His city was working with a national retail developer to redevelop an older mall. Subsequent to agreements with the developer, they were sued for projects in other parts of the country, which has frozen their project. How do you protect against that?
That's a tough situation. I would wonder, I guess it depends at what point in the project implementation you're at. Because if they haven't met, like if you have a redevelopment agreement that defines certain steps that they have to meet in order to keep the redevelopment agreement active and valid, well, then I suggest reviewing that, and if they haven't met or hit their benchmarks, essentially validate that redevelopment agreement and open them all up for a different developer. So that's, I think, having protections in the redevelopment agreement or cooperative agreement, whatever you call it, is important so that you have benchmarks that need to be met, so that if they aren't met, if the developer for some reason gets frozen because they're under litigation, then you can essentially kick them out in favor and open the project up to another developer.
Yeah, and that's kind of a weird situation because, I guess that would make me a little nervous about that developer, the fact that one project would impact another, because theoretically his financing should be independent for each project. So I don't know. It sounds a little fishy, but I guess I'd have to know what the details are on that.
All right, and this question comes in from James. The secondary impact of factory closures or housing demo is a large reduction on taxes. Towns should be careful of dependence on a large taxpayer. I guess that's a little bit more of a comment, if you have any response.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the two cases I put up there with GM, and the reason why I pulled those is that there's a lot of communities that, we're dependent on, they're company towns, and I think it's important to make sure that as a community, you're investing in education, you're investing in, making sure your workforce is well-rounded, and you're encouraging, business incubators and job creation at a smaller level so that you're not necessarily dependent on that one big business that comes into town. That's easier said than done sometimes, but it really is a great comment.
Okay, and our next question comes in from David, and this is in regards to Mamtech. He says it just seems fundamental to verify that the plant existed in China. Did the city and its consultants and the state all assume it existed? Did anybody make an effort to verify? And if so, and they couldn't verify, wouldn't that raise a big red flag?
That's the question everybody's been asking. But yeah, it seems fairly fundamental. There were several different attorneys and consultants that were tasked with finding out if the plans existed, and there was sort of, each time they looked into it, it sounded like there might have been one, or there was one under construction, but then zoning issues caused it to close or something. They never really got a clear answer, and the bond attorneys looked into it, the state looked into it, but ultimately nobody sort of really, like the questioner asks is, why didn't somebody raise the red flag there? I think that's a great question. I think that was sort of raised, but sort of in a hurry to get the deal done, and because it was such a great deal for the community, I think people were willing to overlook basic facts because they wanted to see it happen. And as Andy pointed out, as soon as the city pledged its revenues to pay off the bonds, the bond attorneys stopped looking at Mamtech, and they started looking just to see, they looked at the creditworthiness of the city instead of Mamtech. So, yeah, it's a great example of, even if you hire expensive folks, they may not do their jobs.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of blame to go around. Everybody from the governor's office down to the city, and it's just it's an unfortunate situation.
Okay, and this question comes in from Sherry. What can planners do to draw attention to the connection between land use and economic sustainability?
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's something that planners haven't done well, in my opinion. There seems to be this broken connection between market forces and economic development and the profession of planning. And that's a little bit of a harsh statement, and it's not always true, but it oftentimes is true. I think municipalities and their staff don't always understand the development and how it works, and developers consequently also don't understand that the city is looking out for sort of the greater good and not just their project. And so the question is, the connection between land use and economic development. I think in your comprehensive plan and your long-range strategic plans and your land use plans and your long-range transportation plans, you need to look at what that connection might be. And I think as a planning profession, just speaking for myself, that is really how we need to reinvent ourselves. Is as we get Tea Party pushback on our profession, we need to start talking about how good planning and effective use of resources and sustainable use of resources is what we do as planners, and that involves using land well and protecting the public from bad uses of land.
I think part of that is understanding the revenue landscape associated with land uses. So your municipality understanding how much value you have in the parcels and land uses in your jurisdiction, what those businesses are, and how much tax revenue they create. So when you're making decisions on future development proposed from the developer, if they're looking at relocating or buying existing businesses in favor of some new development, so you can compare if you're gaining tax revenue, if you're losing tax revenue, so you can make a decision that is in the financial interests of your community, which is an important consideration.
And also, Strong Towns has some great analysis on their site about how just building infrastructure can actually cost you more in the long run. And so, I think land use planning can also do that as well. So you need to make sure there's plenty of situations of communities that have zoned large areas and made infrastructure commitments to large areas that they couldn't support in the long run. And so you need to do what Andy just said and look at the actual market analysis and see if it's actually going to be a benefit to your community to develop greenfields, or it's actually going to cost you more in the long run.
All right, this question comes in from James. Are there any examples of municipalities, counties, or states agreeing to share taxes to avoid location competition?
The one I know of is that people always talk about on a regional level is Minneapolis. I don't know of others right off the top of my head. I know there's been a lot of proposals here in the Midwest, in St. Louis, to do that. One of the principals here in our office had worked on some legislation. Here in St. Louis County, there's two types of communities. There's some that join this revenue pool, and then there's some that collect separately. I think that's probably the case in other communities as well. I don't know if you know, Andy, off the top of your head of any other examples, or.
No, I mean, that's right. In St. Louis County, there's sales tax revenue sharing among municipalities in St. Louis County, so that some communities that have less retail than other communities still receive, a certain amount of sales tax that they otherwise wouldn't. Mm-hmm.
But you can opt in or out to join that, and so it creates this sort of goofy setup.
Yeah, administratively it's kind of confusing, a little odd. And then in terms of business retention or attraction, there's, the city and the county recently merged forces in that respect, and then the city contributes money to St. Louis County to fund a new development partnership so that they can team together to attract business to the region.
It really has to be, from a policy level, for that thing to be implemented, it needs to come from the state. And depending on the charter of the community and all that, it's a tough sell for a lot of folks. But it needs to happen, in my opinion, in a lot of communities, because there is this ridiculous competition for retail, people stealing Walmarts from each other, and sort of the net winner is not the taxpayer in that situation. So, yeah, the Walmart, stockholders are the winners of that setup.
All right, this question comes in from Christine. They're seeing NIMBY opposition to mixed-use higher density development in former single-use office light industrial areas. And although there has not been public investment in these proposed projects, the delay and costs are preventing economic development. How best is it to address neighbors' concerns before the massive anti-development PR campaign with misinformation begins?
Yeah. I've been to those meetings many times. I think getting folks, I know this is painful to hear maybe, but I think getting people involved in the planning process and having those community meetings and just having a lot of them and doing charrettes and having people come in and get engaged is probably the best way to head that off, because you may get some great ideas from the general public, and even if you don't, at least they feel like their voice has been heard and their concerns have been addressed. And there's some just anti-everything people, but most people have some legitimate complaints embedded in their anger. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm a big fan of public involvement and getting people to be involved. And even if you get your developer or your property owners at those meetings, all the better. But even if you can't, it's still, I think, a useful exercise. Just make sure that you tell people that it's an exercise and that you'll be passing that information on to the developer. But if it's a privately owned property that the city doesn't control, they don't have to necessarily listen to what the public says. But it might be a good opportunity for that. I don't know what else to say other than that. It's just a really hard thing. People fear what they don't know. And I've been in public meetings where people came up and said they were against a bike trail because they were afraid that somebody was going to come, ride their bike, take their flat screen TV, and ride off down the trail. And it's just, I don't see that happening, but some people are afraid of things that they're not sure on. So it's hard to respond to that.
Okay, and our next question comes in from Donna. How do you protect communities from development booms, and what can you do to not be overcautious so that your community remains stagnant? Any tips?
Good question. I think, and Andrew, jump in here if I'm saying anything wrong, but I think when you have a booming situation and you have a lot of, you say you have an older downtown with historic buildings, you have a lot of developers coming and applying for some sort of assistance, and that things are really booming. It's important at that point to have some clawback provisions in every agreement you have with the developer, so that the city only incentivizes so much, so that if the boom is really booming and everybody outperforms their expectations, then the city isn't giving up all that additional revenue. They're only giving up a portion of what they agreed to at the outset when people's expectations are maybe a little bit lower. And so that way incentives retire earlier, and then the city or county gets that tax revenue earlier.
Yeah, and you're not going to, booms and busts are going to happen, so you just have to make sure that you fully take advantage of those booms when they happen and that you protect the city and you don't give away too much. And when the busts happen, you make sure that you're fiscally well prepared for those and that the development that you've allowed to occur has been done in a smart, a smart growth manner that it's not going to cost you a bunch when a bunch of stuff is sitting there and you're paying for the infrastructure maintenance to keep it up. So, there's no way to protect yourself completely from booms and busts, but you you sort of have to know, I guess, how to handle it.
Right, and that's the embodiment of the public-private partnership, is that, it's a risky project. The developer doesn't want to shoulder all the risk themselves, so they ask the city or the county to shoulder a portion of that risk, and if the project takes off, then everybody wins. That's why it's important to have clawback provisions. It's important to have performance benchmarks, so that if the developer fails at the early stages of the project, then the city can either take the property or put that property out for new bids or something else, and so return that property to productive use.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Our next question comes in from Karen. Can you address the use of CDBG funds in this age of declining CD funds?
What was the last part of the question? In the stage of?
In this age of declining community development funds.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot less of them, and it's tough for communities. I would say make sure you spend those monies well. Increasingly, I know for federal projects, there's more and more stipulations on how you can use those funds, and there's more oversight and there's more paperwork, and they're less fungible, I suppose, is the term.
Right. The applications are super competitive at the state or the federal level. So if you can apply for CDBG money, it's like you need to have a really good project that's really ready to start, so you can put that money to work, because I know the state's going to want to see results.
And I would say, I'll sort of shameless promotion here. We've worked with the state of Missouri on this program called the Missouri Dream Initiative, and it's at modream.org if anybody's interested. And what we've done is we've worked with 39 communities to create a strategic plan for their downtown that includes a whole host of things, including retail and housing analysis and downtown organizational structure review and that sort of thing. And the upshot of that program is that each of these communities have a really strong strategic plan for what they want to see happen in oftentimes their most depressed area. And so that way, when they go to the state or to the federal government or to a private grant philanthropic organization, they have a plan, they have a strategic plan, they have an analysis to back up why they're requesting CDBG money or whatever pot of money they're going after. And I really feel like that puts those communities that have a plan, and that goes back to my, have an economic development plan for your community, that puts those communities at the front of the line for receiving that money. My wife writes grants, and people think that there's a giant pot of money out there that if you just ask for it, it'll rain down on you, and I think most planners realize that that's not the case. Maybe it was at one point, but it's not anymore, and it's not likely to come back. So I think having a good plan of what you're going to spend the money on is really the best way to be the most competitive for those sorts of tools. Hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's actually about what we have time for today. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email Andrew. His email is listed up right now. Andrew and Andy, thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was went over really well, and it seems like people really enjoyed it. I'm going to switch back to my screen now and go over a few reminders on how you can log your CM credits. So if you missed that in the beginning, just stay tuned. All right, so for those of you who are still with us, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM and select today's date, which is Friday, June 14th, and then select today's webcast, which is What Not to Do, Lessons Learned from the Failure of Others. And this webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. It's actually still pending right now, so we are still waiting for it to be approved. It should be approved in the next week or two, so you can just check back on it periodically. We are also recording today's webcast, so you can find a copy of that on our YouTube channel. And with that, this will conclude today's session. I want to thank everyone again for attending.